Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Anything else?
Yeah. Don't do drugs.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my new series on the Emperor Heraclius and the end of the ancient world. Now, the years between 600 and 650 have always been one of my favorite time periods, mostly because I have good taste. No, but for real though, more changes occurred in those 50 years than in the preceding 500 or so years put together. For at the start, in the year 600, the world still looked more or less the way it had since the days of Augustus, with the Mediterranean still a Roman lake, and the lands around them more or less still subservient to the empire. But by 650, the entire world looked different. For by then, Rome had been reduced from a grand empire to a large kingdom, and a new people were busy spreading their faith from the shores of the Indus in the east to the embattled city of Carthage in the far west. But how? How was it that the Roman Empire went from complete dominance to becoming just another medieval kingdom? And for that matter, why were the Arabs able to conquer everything they encountered so seemingly easily? Well, in both instances, the answer is pretty much the same. For in 602, the sitting emperor of Rome was deposed by a lowly centurion named Phocas. Now, apart from his own failings, which were legion, Phocas was also extremely unlucky. For in 603, the Persian king of kings decided to test this new emperor, quickly invading the empire and having more success than he ever could have dreamed of. Now, this war would go on to outlast Phocas himself, as in 610, he in his turn was deposed by a man named Heraclius. Meanwhile, the Persian king of kings had taken advantage of all this Roman weakness, going on to conquer most of the Roman East up to the gates of Constantinople itself.
What a strange person!
It took this new emperor Heraclius another 18 years to finally push the Persians out of Roman territory. And in doing so, won for himself one of the greatest comeback victories in the history of the Roman Empire, and maybe even world history. But the costs of 25 years of grinding war were simply too much to bear for both Persia and Rome, leaving both empires vulnerable by the end. And it would be then, just as Rome and Persia were at their weakest, that an old people following a new creed stormed out of the supposed wastelands to the empire's south. The Persian Empire would eventually be completely destroyed by these newcomers, and Rome would eventually lose everything save for a few enclaves in the far west, most of the lower Balkans, and Asia Minor, reducing her from the queen of the world to a kingdom forever in the shadow of a great world empire to her south. But we have a lot of ground to cover before we get to that point, as the real meat and potatoes of this series will be the 25-year-long conflict between Rome and Persia, the war that literally ended antiquity, and more than any other single event went on to shape the world as we know it to this very day. Now, to truly understand the events of the early 7th century, it's probably necessary to have at least a working understanding of Romano-Persian relations over the years, as these two empires would be by far the biggest actors in our drama to come. So let's cast our eyes back to 95 BCE, when the rising Roman Republic and the newly independent Parthians first made diplomatic contact with one another.
The pleasure is all mine.
Oh, thanks.
At this time, Rome was a turbulent republic on the make, full of backstabbing aristocrats commanding endless hordes of land-hungry legionaries, all equally as eager as their rapacious masters for plunder and glory. Now, during their short time on the world stage, the Romans had gone from rustic yokels overawed by the splendor of even their poorest neighbor, into an imperial order capable of subduing the known world. That in mind, the Romans had developed an extremely dismissive and haughty attitude toward most peoples, as Roman senators were able to halt armies of even the greatest Eastern kings with only a few choice words and a line in the sand. And as you might imagine, that sort of thing tends to go to one's head, especially when we're talking about sociopaths with power.
Now kiss my hand. Go on, kiss it, you bitch.
Meanwhile, far to the east, the core of the once mighty Persian Empire had recently been reforged into an independent state by a new group of Iranian-speaking steppe nomads known as the Parthians. Now, these hardy warriors from the steppes entered the region as mercenaries, but quickly displaced the hated Greeks as the new ruling class through the targeted use of violence and bribery. Not that any Roman would have known or even cared about any of these developments, as they were currently too busy bleeding the provinces of Asia dry to pay for their own endless rounds of civil wars to really give a shit about the politics of barbarians.
I'm not making myself clear. I don't give a fuck.
So that in mind, when a Persian envoy arrived at the court of Rome's greatest general, that avatar of conservative rage, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, he was surprised at how little respect he was shown. When the envoy entered Sulla's chamber, he saw the Roman sitting on a grand chair atop a large platform, resplendent with gold and fine cloths, allowing the Roman to gaze imperiously down his aquiline nose at all those he spoke to. When the envoy eventually asked where his seat was, Sulla's men commanded that the barbarian be seated amongst the other clients and allies of Sulla.
You have a seat right on the stool there.
Confused, the envoy tried to explain that it was beneath the dignity of his master to even consider such a thing, as he was no client of Rome, but the representative of the actual King of Kings, heir to all of Asia.
I don't know how to put this, but I'm kind of a big deal.
Really?
To this, the Romans simply shrugged, telling the envoy he could either take his assigned seat or take his leave without an audience. They really didn't care. Well, after a long wait and a short meeting, the imperious Sulla awarded the Persian envoy with the friendship of the Roman people and sent him on his way with a pat on the head. As being rude and patronizing to envoys of Eastern kings was standard practice for any self-respecting Roman.
I bet you have civic infected penis.
Well, when told of this curt treatment, the Persian king Mithridates II, no, not that one, dummy, grew enraged. For his emissary had, by sitting where he had, acknowledged a lesser status in relation to the Romans, and by not leaving had shown moral weakness in the face of their slight. Furthermore, the foolish envoy had accepted Roman friendship, which in their eyes was seen as submission to Roman interests, the acceptance of client status, the equivalent of the old earth and water demand from the days of Darius. Justifiably enraged at this assault to his dignity as a king, Mithridates had the envoy flayed alive.
The face.
And his hollow skin stuffed with straw before going on to disavow any friendship with the Romans. For as he rightly knew, anyone who befriended Rome would soon have legions stationed on their territory.
Are we the baddies?
Now, the first large-scale conflict between Rome and Persia came in 53 BC, when a man named Crassus, far and away the richest man in Roman history up to that point, decided to invade Persia in order to win for himself some fame and glory. Now, without going too far off into the weeds, all you really need to know is that Crassus was a terrible person. Like fucking awful. A man willing to do anything to advance himself, and oh, I do mean anything.
What's a ZJ?
If you have to ask, big man, you can't afford it.
I mean, truly, he deserves a video all to himself. I could bitch all day. Anyway, though, Crassus had been born into privilege and wealth and would have never had to work a day in his life if he didn't feel like it. But, unluckily for his home city, the young Crassus was a man of energy.
Hey, what was that sound? It was opportunity knocking.
No one knocked, you just barged in.
As a younger man, Crassus had become one of the richest men in Rome by running a shady firefighting business. Now, don't misunderstand me. That is to say that he was in the business of fighting against his own city and people with fire. You see, Crassus's men were known to set fire to properties their master coveted. His men would then refuse to put out the flames unless the owner quickly sold the property on. Otherwise, they would all just stand by and get drunk, laughing as the frantic owner rushed in and out to save what they could from the inferno that they had started. Then, after the last embers had snuffed themselves out, Crassus would appear, flanked by dozens of club-wielding thugs, and there he would make the now wretched owner another much lower offer. one not readily refused should he wish to keep his legs from being broken. Another favored trick of his was to use his connections to the dictator Sulla to falsely accuse men of treason so that he could personally confiscate all their wealth, leaving their grieving families to die in the unforgiving streets, declaring it treason to give even a scrap of bread to the enemies of the state. Well, in his later years, Crassus had graduated from city-level mafia extortion rackets and crucifying 15,000 recalcitrant gladiators along the roadside to the game of nations. For the old vulture had decided that the Persians would be his next victim. After all, everyone knew that Easterners were both rich and effeminate in equal measure. The Romans finding the fact that they wore pants instead of just letting their dick hang freely particularly hilarious. I mean, what kind of men would be ashamed of such a thing? Look at it!
My husband used to dress like a gladiator and make me pull his chariot.
Okay, Carl, I have some questions about the construction of this head. Okay.
With that in mind, Crassus the Rich used his vast fortune to buy as many as 45,000 men, intent on using them to plunder the riches of the Orient. But, as most who buy their commands soon find out, warfare is a hard game, one that punishes greed and stupidity like an angry god hurling thunderbolts. After spending a few seasons extorting the people of Syria for whatever wealth he could rip from their bleeding fingers, the red-faced, fat 60-something would-be generalissimo of the Roman world gathered his troops and marched east into the hot and unforgiving Syrian desert. Annoyed that the Persians refused to meet him in an open battle, Crassus pushed his men hard, and soon they began to outstrip their supply lines as they pressed ever farther east. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity on the march, scouts returned with news of the enemy, claiming that the Parthian horde had diverted from the royal road and disappeared into the hazy deserts. Well, immediately Crassus ordered his army to follow the tracks into the scorching sands, reasoning that the war could be over in a single day should his men catch these fleeing barbarians.
Puny, level 5, too bad.
After a few days of torture upon the hot sands, Crassus finally met the Parthian army a few miles outside a city named Carrhae. Now, the former steppe nomads had chosen their position well, placing themselves between the desperately thirsty Romans and the cool waters of the Euphrates River, and dared them to do something about it.
I will block you. I swear it.
While eager to press the attack, the Romans moved to engage but were soon spread thin across miles of open ground, with entire units cut off and held down by fast-moving skirmishers on horseback. By midday, Crassus's once mighty army was split into many pockets, strung out over miles, isolated, alone. And for hours the steppe nomads shot at the Roman infantry before peeling away, black clouds of death falling on ever-thinning shield walls, the Persian supply of arrows seemingly endless. But despite mounting casualties and frustration, the Romans under Crassus returned fire as best they could with rocks and spears, all while their formations advanced slowly toward the life-giving waters. But after what must have felt like an eternity, the light Persian horsemen finally broke, some throwing down weapons before running away in fear from the triumphant Romans. Sensing that the tide had turned, the angry legionaries would surge forward for the kill, breaking ranks and rushing on in a loose mob, hacking and screaming abuse. Then, in a move that became known to history as the Parthian shot, the fleeing horsemen would then turn in their saddles and unleash a torrent of armor-piercing arrows into the disordered Romans, ripping their unprotected bodies to shreds.
To shreds, you say?
And before the Romans knew it had even hit them, light lancers and hillmen descended upon them from the flanks, quickly intermingling with the heavy Roman infantry, isolating them from the group and one another on open ground. Then the butcher's work began, as the slow and heavy Roman infantry were systematically taken to the ground with nets and ropes before being stabbed to death by their lighter and more numerous attackers.
To shreds, you say?
All was dust, blood, and chaos. The same tactic was repeated over and over and over again on each isolated Roman band to equally good effect, and before the day was out, the Roman army was simply no more. Only Gaius Cassius Longinus, that future assassin of Caesar, managed to escape with a mere 10,000 men in good order. The rest, including Crassus himself, were either captured or killed that day. It's said that the Persians took nearly 10,000 Romans prisoner, along with 7 of their sacred gilded eagle standards, before then leaving the bodies of over 20,000 of their companions on the field to be eaten by wild dogs and birds, thus inflicting one of the worst defeats in Roman history. As for the man himself, Crassus and a small group of retainers tried to break out, but were soon killed by the roving Parthian horsemen. His head was then gingerly removed and spirited away to the Parthian capital. Legend has it that when the head arrived, the Persian king of kings was watching a performance of the Bacchae by Euripides. When told of this grisly trophy's arrival, the lead actor brushed the prop skull aside that he was going to use and rushed to collect the head of the fallen Roman. And so it was that Crassus, richest man in the world, was forced to play the role of the dead king of thieves, all for the amusement of the Persian king. A fitting end for the man that aimed to treat the king of kings as if he were just some barbarian. Now, despite this and many, many other stories like it, trust me, we could be here all damn day if I decided to keep us here. For most of the history between Rome and Persia, things were peaceful, like 97% of the time. You know, except when guys like Trajan were in charge, but that's a whole other fucking story. That guy was crazy. No, for most of their long history together, Rome and Persia cooperated, with trade and populations flowing more or less uninterrupted between the two empires. This was mostly because the two depended on each other, for despite having access to the Indian Ocean via Egypt, Rome's main train connection to the east was always the overland route via the Persian Empire. And this was mutually beneficial, as the Roman West seems to have been Persia's main source of precious metals, with the Persians charging huge duties on any eastern goods bound for Rome, and Rome for her part just happy to have the silk and spices. But despite the high taxes, the trade between the two empires was lucrative enough that Rome and Persia probably would have done just about anything to keep that money flowing. Which meant that wars were more often than not rare and fought for limited goals. You know, unless you're Trajan again, or I guess Khosroes II. Now this only tangentially applies, but
I have a microphone and you don't.
In 97 CE, the Chinese explorer and diplomat Gan Ying made it to the Parthian Empire, tasked with gathering intelligence on the nations of the West, and if possible, enlisting their aid against the growing power of the nomads of Inner Asia. In this, Gan was mostly unsuccessful, as the Persians had absolutely no interest in fighting the emperor's proxy wars. But it wasn't a total bust, as while in Persia he did learn of an even greater empire far to the west he called Daqin, or Great China. And by the way, that name lets you know how full of themselves the Chinese actually were, seeing themselves as the only civilized people on Earth. Now the Persians grew alarmed at Gan's increasing interest in the Romans, fearing that together they might find some way to bypass the Persian Empire completely. And if that were allowed to happen, Persia would be ruined, starved of her western trade and made a target in the eyes of the ever-hungry Romans now that their usefulness had waned.
Well, he always did have an inflated opinion of himself.
So in order to dissuade him from going any farther west, the Persians told Gan that there was no direct land route to Daqin, that the way was blocked by violent seas and tall mountains, and also there might be a wizard.
Lean technique! Behold, my Hamon bubble launcher!
Nah, but for real though, instead they told Gan that Rome lay far to the south, 40 days sail by ship, into the Persian Gulf, down and around the Arabian Peninsula, and up the Red Sea to distant and fabulous Egypt. Well, to this, Gan simply sighed, as he had very little experience of sea travel, and feared the dangers such a voyage might bring. And so, much to his Persian host's relief, Gan Ying decided that he had gone far enough for one lifetime, and turned back east, never visiting the Roman Empire.
Bro, sorry.
It's alright.
Moving forward in time to the 3rd century, a native dynasty known as the Sassanids overthrew the Parthians. And after they took over, Persia became steadily more powerful. But newfound strength did little to alter the status quo between her and the Romans, as trade was just too damn lucrative. And despite defeating multiple emperors over the years and extracting huge tribute payments of gold, the years between the 3rd century and the late 6th saw the border move very little. And to be honest, relations between the two empires could be downright cordial at times, with letters going back and forth between the two monarchs describing each other as the eyes of the world, bulwarks of civilization in a world filled with barbarians. A great example of this cooperation occurred in 481. In that year, the Persian king of kings was again defeated by the Hephthalites, the so-called White Huns, and worse yet, taken prisoner. Now, the defeated king was ordered to pay a massive and humiliating tribute in gold and silver before the Huns would even discuss releasing him. But times had been tough, and the Persians only had a fraction of the sum on hand, which caused them to send envoys to the Roman Emperor Zeno for help. Now, the problem was, Zeno wasn't really in a position to just send off carts full of gold, even if it was to save the life of the King of Kings, as the man himself had only just taken the throne and was currently grappling for power with overmighty nobles and would-be warlords inside his own armed forces. Anyway, despite Zeno being in just about the worst position possible and constantly on the verge of being deposed by power-mad morons, he somehow found the extra money for the ransom and quickly paid what the Persians asked, reasoning that it would be better in the long run to prop up their civilized neighbors than see them fall to steppe nomads. After all, the two empires were kindred spirits in a world full of strange peoples and unknown customs. Both thought it best to keep both eyes of the world open.
Wrong hat.
I take a 7.5.
Now here's something we hope you'll really like.
If a Roman citizen had been thrown forward in time from the days of Trajan to that of Maurice Tiberius, they would have been bitterly disappointed. For our traveler and men like him had been educated to believe that each public labor was a way to strengthen the empire, while also fulfilling their obligations to later generations, and of course, honoring the gods of their fathers. And so it had been since the day that Remus had his skull caved in with a shovel. But that's a story for another day.
He was the only man I ever killed worth remembering.
That in mind, as our traveler looked around this new world, he wouldn't have seen the accumulated works of ages, but decay. In fact, it appeared that some of these degenerate sons of Romulus seemed to be living in the ruins of a more prosperous age, their sense of public duty and civic and manly pride all but extinguished. Ugh. Now, the wise men of the current age may have tried to cheer up our traveler by pointing out that Rome still ruled the known world, albeit a much smaller world than that of her ancestors, and that the Roman people still had their republic, their senate, and her citizens still lived under the rule of law, watched over by a semi-divine emperor. But the traveler from a more prosperous age would have looked at these men and scoffed, as it was clear to him, at least, that almost everything had changed since men like Trajan or Hadrian had ruled the world. He would have told anyone who would listen that, in his day, the Roman Empire was the only power in the world worth speaking of, with as many as 50 million people living within her borders. Not that he would have been counting, as to him his fellow Romans, both free and unfree, would have seemed like grains of sand in a desert, simply infinite, not even worth counting. And despite our traveler being kind of a moralizing prig, he may have been right about most of it. Now, the Roman Empire of 602 was very different from that of, say, 150. I mean, by this point, the empire was over 700 years old, with a population reduced by war, mismanagement, and disease to a mere 17 million people. A far cry from the 50 million souls that once called men like Trajan Imperator. By now, the West had fallen away piece by piece to Germanic invaders, and the East was more or less a frail shadow of her former self. As yet undivided, yet riddled with weakness, corruption, and, worst of all, subversive religious minorities. But though the empire was in the midst of an irreversible decline, for many in the wealthy cities of the East at least, life was probably as good as it ever had been, as hard times hadn't affected their fortunes at all. Hell, if anything, it had given them opportunities, as they bought up the land of smallholders everywhere, forcing once free men to become sharecroppers on land that once belonged to their fathers. You know, progress. Anyway, the reigning emperor of the time was a competent professional named Maurice Tiberius. a man who had more or less single-handedly held the empire together for 2 decades with little more than sheer bloody-minded determination. Oh yeah, and violence. Lots of violence. Let's put it this way, this man literally wrote the book on Roman warfare, the often quoted and far less read Strategicon. As a younger man, Maurice had personally taken the field against Avars, Slavs, Isaurians, and Persians, and defeated each of them with skill and extreme prejudice. While back home, he managed to walk a thin line between ruthless tyrant and beloved father of his people. At least for a while. But this picture of rosy stability was deceptive, as all wasn't cotton candy and carnivals in Maurice's empire. In fact, the empire had basically been bankrupt for at least the last 50 years, and there was little, if anything, the emperors, no matter their intentions, could do about it. See, the problem was actually very simple. The empire was just too damn big. Too many problems competing for way too few resources. Now, the empire didn't sink into this low state all at once, but much like my old Ford Escape, I will remember you. Succumbed under the weight of accumulated problems after ages of heavy use and willful neglect. I mean, to begin with, the empire of this era was nowhere near as well managed as that of Augustus, or fuck, even Diocletian, if we're being honest.
What'd I do?
Man, everything's broken around this place.
Now, several hundred years' worth of civil wars and religious conversions had resulted in a grotesque transformation from an empire ruled by laws and classically trained bureaucrats to a holy state ruled by favorites, yes-men, and weirdo priests that fretted all day about what their fellow citizens believed in.
Believe in something called God.
You know, a state where loyalty was prized more than proficiency, and exceptional people were often found floating in rivers with 72 knife wounds in their back as their less talented contemporaries drank themselves into oblivion and laughed at jokes that weren't funny.
Oh, you got a murderous rage in you, and I like it.
Sorry. Anyway, long story short, later emperors were forced to rely on their close associates and others they knew they could, trust, instead of trained bureaucrats, for reasons that could literally take up a video all its own. But basically, instead of elected officials or educated technocrats being placed in positions of power, the emperor's friend Dave could run things because, you know, he could trust Dave not to rebel and disappear with the army because, you know, Dave's a solid dude. But because you and I know Dave is actually fucking awful, he's trying to be less dependent on the emperor. So instead of doing his, job, Dave begins stealing money from his office so that he has something to fall back on should the emperor stop thinking he's such a cool dude.
Who does number 2 work for?
That's right, buddy. You show that turd who's boss.
Now, corruption like this became endemic, draining the empire of her wealth and effectiveness, with money that should have been reinvested in the people and, the land, instead going into the pockets of petty lords and guys who know a guy. A few hundred years of that sort of thing and left the landscape littered with ruins of a more prosperous age. Broken aqueducts and roads overgrown with weeds and bandits, towns shrunken to a quarter of their previous size, and a population of desperate poor people, overtaxed, ignorant, brainwashed folk, too stupid to realize when they're being stolen from or when their rights are being threatened.
Go away, Baton!
I think I might actually have some hostility I need to work through. Hold on.
You fucking cocksucker! You cocksucker! You cocksucker! Ah, 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 ah.
Anyway, quite apart from all the corruption I mentioned, and yet strangely a product of it, rose a man named Justinian the Great. Now, this might sound like a great thing if you like to shove pennies up your ass and watch a lot of History Channel.
Hunter, your blade has suffered a catastrophic failure and can no longer continue with testing. For that reason, I have to dismiss you from the forge.
As Justinian's traditionally remembered as a great ruler, who, like a supernova to a dying star, sent out rays of Roman greatness before it was snuffed out by men whose vision didn't reach quite as far as his own. Or whatever the fuck, man. In reality, the so-called restorer of the Roman world was a petty, unstable bigot with a god complex who spent money like a drunken sailor on shore leave, lavishing his people's wealth on opulent churches, huge tribute payments, jewels for his hated wife, and of course expensive and bloody wars of expansion. As such, he rarely had anything to fall back on during bad times.
When the cash flow starts to slow down, there's no reserve.
Now, apart from my, personal hatred for the man,
You're acting weird, man. Are you okay?
Justinian was also profoundly unlucky. For during the height of his power and influence, life as everyone knew it came to an abrupt end. For in 541, a new disease swept through the known world which killed tens of millions of people. It's thought that this was the first Western outbreak of the bubonic plague, with infected fleas riding via camelback and ship from as far off as China to the edge of the Atlantic Ocean and just about everywhere in between. And yeah, I know about the Antonine plagues, don't at me, bro.
Backseat driver.
Now, some estimates claim that Constantinople alone fell from a high of 600,000 people at the start of Justinian's reign to about 400,000 by its end, and that the empire itself lost an estimated 6 million people, as wave after wave of plague periodically came back to cripple population growth for decades in certain areas. And almost as destructive as the plagues were the successes of Justinian's many Western conquests, for they soon switched from glorious acquisition to serious liability, as Rome now had vast new lands to defend in Africa, Spain, and Italy, but without any tax base or excess population to support it. And apart from North Africa, most of these provinces remained a drain for decades to come.
Every time I come in the kitchen, you in the kitchen.
Anyway, long story short, by the end of Justinian the Great's long and glorious reign, Rome was overextended, riddled with plague, underpopulated, her infrastructure was crumbling, and the men who should have been fixing things were too busy stealing money and trying to build independent power bases to give a flying shit.
Here's the good news. I'm sorry.
And so, by the 590s, the empire's population had fallen to a new low of around 17 million citizens. Cities contracted around new centers, wolves bred in huge numbers, and primeval forest began to reclaim what was once meticulously cleared farmland.
40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes, the dead rising from the grave.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. Enough, I get the point.
In fact, the fringes of the old empire seemed to be returning to their primal state, with much of Europe reverting to the way it had been before the Romans had ever conquered it. With petty barbarian tribes in constant war with one another, old cities abandoned and new villages propping up around crude hill forts run by powerful warlords named Skulldrinker. And yet, despite all that, there were bright spots. As trade doesn't appear to have suffered much in the larger cities, as it would appear that even scary-ass barbarians seemed willing to trade what they had for Roman gold and silver. And, for what it's worth, even at this late stage, piracy appears to have been only a minor threat. Well, after Justinian the Great, Rome was blessed with a series of competent, if not outstanding emperors, like Tiberius II or Maurice. I don't include Justin II, because that guy was nuttier than fucking squirrel shit. No, I'm serious, this dude would randomly, bite other people and make guttural animal noises whenever asked to give his opinion on matters of state. He was fun. Either way, though, the point is that after Justinian the Great got the empire in over its head, his successors were forced to pilot a sinking ship through some of the rockiest shoals imaginable. And, I mean, for what it's worth, most of the non-crazy ones seem to do a decent job, providing the empire with a long stretch of relatively good governance. The eye of an ever-widening storm. But you know how it is, every time I start talking about one subject, I quickly realize that it can't be fully understood unless several other events and concepts are introduced. But then I have to explain those in the same way, which reveals yet more tangents that need explaining, and now I'm stuck spinning my tires explaining the concept of basic Roman architecture or the difference between a Saxon and a Frank. Anyway, how far along are we? Oh shit. Yeah, that's enough for now. The Emperor Maurice Tiberius had never been a popular man. As upon his accession, the man had inherited a world's worth of problems, including rampant corruption at home and constant invasions from abroad. Out east, the Persian War was entering its 10th year, and the enemy now held huge swaths of the contested border region. And worse yet, were now forcing the Romans to grind through fortress after fortress, retaking it. While out west, the Goths and Lombards never did stop causing the Romans trouble since they'd retaken the region, which of course meant that by now, Italy was a wasteland, its people, crops, and infrastructure all but destroyed by the constant fighting. And things were arguably worse, at least in a political sense, on the Spanish coast, where the Romans had more or less been pushed back behind city walls, the local governors unable to project Roman power into the countryside more than even a few miles. Well, apart from all that, Maurice also inherited an absolute fiscal nightmare, as it seems that none of his predecessors had been able to dig the empire out of the financial hole that Justinian had dug for them.
There's no reserve!
Well, being an ex-general, Maurice knew well how to settle the problem of foreign invasion, and over the next 20 or so years managed to give the empire victory after victory. But the home front was an entirely different matter, as wars, even defensive ones, tend to be expensive. This meant that for most of his reign, the bulk of imperial revenue flowed toward the army at the expense of everything else. Back home, all the common citizens knew was that whatever money they paid to the greedy emperor wasn't being reinvested in their city or their local towns, but instead put on ships and carts as fast as it was paid and swiftly taken off to some far-off location to grease the palm of some sweaty barbarian. And as time went on, Maurice became less and less popular, with every calamity of the age interpreted as God's punishment for his greed and negligence.
I was up super late last night beefing your mom.
My mom's dead.
Yeah, because I beefed her to death.
Whoa, what's your problem? Why are you being such a jerk?
Now the events that would one day lead to Maurice's death began in the 590s, when a new people known as the Avars once again began to raid Roman lands along the Danube River. The Avars were a mostly Turkish confederation of tribes that had over the course of the last 150 or so years migrated from the edge of the Chinese Empire all the way to the fringes of Rome itself. Well, in spite of the Avars' status as refugees fleeing an ancient homeland, they were known as vicious fighters, large warriors standing over 6 feet tall, as skilled at riding and shooting as they were cleaving a man's skull in two with an axe. And because of this reputation, the Avars had been able to subjugate and absorb an alarming number of peoples and tribes on their way into Roman lands. Around the year 596, these people began pressing hard against Roman towns and cities near the Danube River. Now, in order to combat this, Maurice declared that he would lead his legions in person against the invaders, the first emperor since Theodosius the Great to even suggest such a thing. But after what I assume was an attack of gout, Maurice changed his mind about halfway there and instead sent the army forward under the command of his brother Peter. Now, this perplexed and angered the legions, as they assumed that the emperor was simply too afraid of these newcomers to go in person, as the Avars and their Slavic allies had gained an almost supernatural reputation for cruelty and terror over the years. Regardless, though, the thought that their emperor might be a coward didn't sit well with the men and began to fester in their minds as time ground forward. A few years later, around the year 600, sources claim that a large Roman force numbering as many as 12,000 men was surrounded and forced to surrender by the Avar Khan. Now to me, 12,000 seems obscenely too high, as that would basically mean that the entire field army along the Danube River had been captured, which I highly doubt. Either way, though, it's clear that a metric shit ton of Roman soldiers had been captured, and the Avar Khan was demanding a huge tribute payment in gold and silver in order to spare their lives. It's said that a centurion named Phocas was chosen by the legions to approach the emperor in person and beg that the ransom be paid. Otherwise, as he told the man, the Avars would slaughter them all. Sources claim that the Emperor Maurice Tiberius politely listened to the centurion before explaining that he would not be funding the enemy's war effort by paying tribute to a nation under arms. For you see, the Empire had little money to spare for her own war efforts, and that to pay such a large and ignominious tribute would only weaken these efforts further. He was terribly sorry about the fate of the men, and if it would make this Phocas feel better, he would order the priests of the Empire to say a few prayers on their behalf to, speed their souls on to heaven. Well, understandably, Phocas grew angry at this and told the emperor where he could stick his thoughts and prayers. Some sources even claim that Phocas was then drug away by the palace guards, who duly beat the shit out of him and threw him out of the palace like some kind of drunken malcontent. And as you might imagine, the tribute not being forthcoming, the unfortunate legionaries were all put to death en masse by the Avars. And also, as you might imagine, news of this put yet another wedge between Maurice and his people, with some whispering that the greedy emperor was secretly glad to be rid of so many men he would have otherwise had to pay. The year 602 began with a series of amphibious raids by the Avars and Slavs. You see, over the winter, the crafty barbarians had constructed a decent little navy made up mostly of light, shallow draft boats capable of carrying several dozen to maybe 100 men at a time. But though these crafts were crude and would have been destroyed if they ever met a real naval force, their mere presence essentially made the Avars master of the border region, as the river was no longer an obstacle, but a highway, allowing them, just like the Vikings 200 years later, to appear without warning wherever they chose. In response, the emperor once again ordered his brother Peter into the region, as he was competent enough, loyal, and best of all, cheap. The conflict had been frustrating to say the least, with scouts often never returning from patrols and Avar warbands more often than not able to retreat faster than the Romans could pursue them. But as summer gave way to autumn, it appeared that all the men's hard work had finally paid off, as they'd recently managed to cut off a huge Slavic army, and over the course of several small engagements, more or less destroyed them. Despite this victory, Peter knew he had only destroyed a few subject tribes, and that the real enemy had escaped with most of their loot and slaves in tow. And so, he and his brother the Emperor decided that a punitive raid north of the Danube would be the best course of action. Now, this was a sound move on paper, as Maurice's own strategicon recommended that the Avars and Slavs be fought in winter, as a people that relied so heavily on ambush and surprise attack would find such things far more difficult once the leaves had fallen away and the newly fallen snow revealed their tracks. Not only that, but Peter knew that the northern barbarians were about to bring in their yearly harvest of grain, and so he reasoned if he could place his army on those lands and forage for the winter, this would not only ruin the enemy and probably cause them a famine, but it would also be a way to avoid paying for the army's maintenance for an entire season, thus saving his brother a little money. Now, all this sounded great from the point of view of the Emperor, as he could strike at the enemy and save money at the same time. It was really a win-win for him. But the thing was, no one, not the Emperor, and definitely not his brother Peter, asked the common soldiers how they felt about any of this. As if someone had, it would have become apparent very quickly that none of the men wanted to go north, like, at all. All they wanted was to winter over in a city, preferably a large one. You know, a place with free and easy access to cheap booze, hot meals, and most of all, women. And now here was Peter, the Emperor's brother, using words like duty and obligation while seemingly caring nothing for the hardships his proposed campaign would bring on the men themselves. After all, hadn't they just defeated the enemy? Something like that deserved a season of rest, not a hard winter spent in tents. Meanwhile, as the common soldiers were grumbling about wet feet and long marches, there was a small but growing cadre of disaffected officers, all too willing to use this for their own personal benefit. Now, not a great deal is known about the man who would one day be known to us as Flavius Phocas, Emperor of the Romans, which is kind of weird because it would be his actions that would inadvertently begin the war that ended the ancient world. In fact, sources appear almost deliberately patchy and overwhelmingly hostile, with historians acting as though they'd been personally attacked by this man. I mean, just listen to this description by the legendary Edward Gibbon written in the 1780s. Phocas does not appear to be less hateful in the exercise than in the acquisition of power. The pencil of an impartial historian has delineated the portrait of a monster, his diminutive and deformed person, the closeness of his shaggy eyebrows, his red hair, his beardless chin, and his cheek disfigured and discolored by a formidable scar. Ignorant of letters, of laws, and even of arms, he indulged in the supreme rank a more ample privilege of lust and drunkenness, and his brutal pleasures were either injurious to his subjects or disgraceful to himself. Edward Gibbon. Now, most of that's just the rantings of an angry 18th century aristocrat clutching his pearls at the idea of a common soldier usurping the imperial title, but as you'll soon see, there was more than a little truth in what he said.
Well, you know, I'm gonna need more of a commitment than that, Mark.
Despite his obscure origins, Phocas was chosen to lead a rebellion within the legions, and after making sure he had everything he needed, Phocas ordered Peter and any loyalist he might have arrested, and as soon as they were in irons, quickly halted the march north, which, of course, made him immediately popular with the men. Now at this point, Phocas was in a similar situation to Alaric the Goth a couple hundred years before, the man not demanding a crown, but a promotion. And so to that end, he and his officers sent a letter to Maurice's own son, a man named Theodosius, in which he asked the young man to take power away from his corrupt father, using the Danube legions as leverage. A letter that, of course, went unanswered. Meanwhile, as Phocas was waiting for a response, he told his men that they were going to go to the capital in order to put some pressure on Maurice, which, again, instantly made him popular with anyone and everyone that hated the current emperor. As Phocas's legions approached the capital, Maurice did his best to gather troops for a defense. But, try as he might, he couldn't get any of his once loyal generals to act on his behalf, most of them either too far away or not having enough troops to really affect anything at all. So, in a desperate attempt to defend the capital, Maurice ordered that the imperial armories be opened to the citizens of Constantinople so that they might defend the city themselves.
AK-47s for everyone!
But tensions within the city were extremely high, and the newly armed civilians only managed to keep discipline for about a day and a half before they began fighting against one another with their new toys. Maurice, for his part, seeing this, accepted that his situation was hopeless, and slipped out of the city one night headed for nearby Chalcedon just across the water from the smoldering capital, hoping that things might just kind of, work themselves out. A few days later, the gates of Constantinople were flung open to Phocas by some rioting sports fanatics wearing green, and he and his triumphant legions marched into the capital like they owned the place, which they now did. As it didn't take long for Phocas to convince the Patriarch and at least a few key notables to recognize him as the legitimate emperor. Then, after a hasty coronation, Phocas ordered that Maurice and his entire family be rounded up and murdered, reasoning that he couldn't be truly secure on the throne with the ex-royal family still kicking about. Pretty standard shit.
Your mother must not have raised you right, because you're not saying very nice things.
Even as Phocas's assassins were making their way toward his refuge, the Emperor Maurice ordered his son to take what loyal legionaries they had left and travel east toward the Persian Empire, reminding his son that he had personally rescued the current King of Kings from a very similar situation only a few years before. And he hoped that now that the shoe was on the other foot, the young Khosroes II would help his son retake the throne and punish this centurion Phocas for his crimes against the purple. The two of them then bade a tearful goodbye, and he was off, never to see one another again. For not long after his son had left for the east, Maurice and most of his family were captured and murdered by Phocas's men. His head and that of his sons were then brought to the capital where they were displayed until they, quote, started to stink. But that was simply a prelude to even more violence, as Phocas still needed to find a way to pay his men. After all, most men don't agree to turn outlaw and march on the capital for free. Fuck no, these men were promised a bonus, or barring that, an opportunity for plunder. But now Phocas was at a loss, as he just kind of always assumed that Maurice was just as big a piece of shit as he was, and just took it for granted that the former emperor just had large cash reserves on hand should anything go wrong in his personal life. But much to his annoyance, Maurice had no Swiss accounts or piles of gold hidden away in the catacombs. No, in fact, there was shockingly little gold or silver on hand, at all, as Maurice really had just been doing his best to tread water, with money going out as soon as it came in.
There's no reserve!
Well, Phocas's men were already growing restless, and he feared being usurped should they fail to receive their just rewards. Phocas knew it could easily be his body that would be next displayed across the city in pieces. And so he started doing what he did best, lying his ass off. He told his men that Maurice's supporters had stolen their pay, which, as you might imagine, quickly spiraled into a nightmare of violence and bloodshed. Boy, that escalated quickly. Yeah, from what I can gather, this man literally let his men loot the homes of the bureaucracy and ruling classes, and worse yet, allowed his men to murder a bunch of them. Now, don't get me wrong, it was pretty customary and standard to murder at least a few dozen people when you took power back in the day, but this was different. As most of the folks that were killed weren't loyalists per se, but simply people who just worked for the government. Clerks, scribes, mint workers, as well as royal cousins and father-in-laws twice removed. Now, needless to say, after this, many of the most rich and powerful men of the empire began to nurse a deep hatred for Phocas, as, you know, he had just allowed his low-class thugs to loot their homes and brutalize their family members, rendering them terrified and potentially disloyal, ready to throw themselves behind anyone that looked like they stood a chance against this new emperor. Now there are two versions of what came next, and the truth basically boils down to which side you believe more, as they both had an equally good reason to lie. As in 602, Phocas claims that he had sent a column of troops to deal with the former emperor's son, Theodosius. Now he claims that his men caught and killed the young man somewhere in southern Asia Minor, and that the battered and cut-up head they displayed in Constantinople was really the real thing. But this would also be pretty convenient, as if Theodosius really was alive, he would by right be the legitimate emperor of the Romans, something Phocas could never tolerate. Now the other version of the story sees Theodosius flee his pursuers until he reaches the land of one of his father's loyal generals, a man named Narses, Magister Militum of the Orient, or put more simply, leader of most of the armies along the eastern border. Narses, for his part, then proclaimed his loyalty to the rightful emperor and began consolidating power in the region and bracing for an attack. Now all this would of course be very convenient for Narses and then later Khosroes II of Persia. As whether or not the man they had in their possession was the actual son of Maurice, it would benefit them greatly to claim that he was. Either way though, in early 603, a man appeared in Mesopotamia claiming to be Theodosius, son of Maurice Tiberius and rightful ruler of the Romans. And soon after that, the region rose in revolt.
Anarchy! I don't even know what that means, but I love it!
Now, Phocas was smart enough to understand most of this, and he immediately took steps to avoid war with the Persians. It was customary for emperors and kings of kings to exchange gifts upon their accession as a sign of respect. And so knowing this, in early 603, Phocas used some of the treasure his men had looted from the capital to pay off the Persian king of kings. But despite the gifts he'd sent, Khosroes II rejected formal recognition out of hand. Worse yet, the angry monarch told the Roman envoys that he considered Phocas a vile usurper, a simple subject presuming to play the role of emperor. More threatening still, Khosroes told them that Maurice had been considered a second father to him, and that he and the entire Persian Empire had gone into mourning for the man that had once saved his life.
I know it. My father went the same way.
Needless to say, by the end of their meeting, Phocas's men